Language is in a constant state of change. The way that you use language is not the same way that your parents used it, it's not the same way that your grandparents used it, etc., on up the chain from generation to generation. And as you add up those changes across generations, they really become enormously cumulative, such that, as you see on page 45, one language like English can change so dramatically across those generations that you can't even recognize, you can't even read the oldest English. So Old English around 950 AD, there you can try to make your way through that paragraph of the Lord's Prayer, but you can't read it. It's just incomprehensible to us today. So if you think for a minute how dictionaries are written, how would you imagine to yourself that you were to write a dictionary? How would you go about doing it? Some people would say that they would go about writing the words as they should be used. I would write the definition to the word as it was originally intended by the inventor, and you would be inflexible in changing over time. But how dictionary writers actually do things is they take a word and they analyze its common usage, how most people implement the word. And sometimes a given word can drastically change in its meaning over time, just because people shift in the way that they're using it. Now, we've seen lots of examples of this in slang words, but I'm not even talking necessarily about slang words. Sometimes a given word can be used by people incorrectly. I say incorrectly, according to one generation's standards, but it becomes correct usage over time because that's how most people use it. And what is correct within a language is defined by usage, not by some pedantic authority that gets to decide. So if you have thought before that that certain ways of speaking are more correct or less correct, my hope is that throughout this course you will be able to adjust your expectations for what is correct or incorrect in language, so that we realize together that what is correct is defined as what people do. Now, there are two basic ways that these rules for language, what is correct, are maintained over time. And one of those ways I've already described. We've seen it in action in the Nigerian Sign Language case study. And that is, when there is insufficient information embedded in the linguistic code can shift so that more information is required of a speaker, so that ambiguity is reduced, so that what's required of the speaker becomes more clear over time. However, we also see that on page 46, that second bullet point there where it says new learners need to be able to learn the language, this describes that there is some kind of filtering process that can happen on the part of children learning a language, such that if there is some requirement in the linguistic code that is too difficult to learn and doesn't provide much benefit in reducing ambiguity and increasing clarity, then children just won't learn it. So basically, children provide this role of being filters for a language to keep it from becoming either too confusing and complicated, or also from being too ambiguous. So children in both cases are going to implement additional requirements across generations to a language to be more specific or less specific, so that it reaches some equilibrium, some perfect balance point where it's neither too complex or too simple. There is another example in the text described on page 48 and 49 of how this could happen, not just on from the point of view of children, but also that adults learning a new language, a second language, could be filters if they are acquiring the language in massive numbers. So huge numbers of immigrants, especially, or when in Middle Ages, when countries were being taken over by ruling parties of other countries and enforcing a formal language on that country that wasn't the first language of those speakers, then we can see that that the adults who are learning that language provide some kind of filtering process. And the specific example here given in our text is of Vikings who spoke Old Norse but had to interact with people who spoke English. Now, at the time, English, like other Germanic languages, contained in it reflexive markers that described actions that are done by one person to him or herself, like I shaved myself, I shot myself, I scratched myself, etc. These verbs in English can be described as something to yourself, himself. That word self is the reflexive marker. But it's only required today in English in a limited number of situations. For instance, if the context in which you're describing this verb is self-explanatory, like you could only do it to yourself and not to anybody else, then you would not have to describe that you did it to yourself. You would not use the word self in that sentence. That is not the case, however, with other Germanic languages. The reason why this reflexive marker is no longer required in English is that those Vikings who were trying to learn English failed to learn those reflexive markers. They were essentially a filter for learning that English language, where they learned those parts of the language that were necessary in order to reduce ambiguity, but they ignored those reflexive markers that were not necessary in order to reduce ambiguity. So this is two examples here where children or adults can serve as filters to keep the specificity of a language within proper bounds. In the last section of the chapter, Digging Deeper, we read a little bit more about the evolution of language as studied by experimental researchers, where experimentalists will set up some kind of situation where language can be used by subjects in shifting ways over time. And the situations will vary depending on the type of linguistic component that the researchers are interested in studying. But one example here is on page 51, where you see these sort of hieroglyphics of what one student was drawing in order to communicate a certain cognitive construct to another student on the other end of a computer terminal. And these students would draw pictures for each other to try to communicate some kind of thought. But as you look at these pictures, you can see that the hieroglyphics are very abstract in most cases. You might be able to see the root of the symbol, as we see in the example of firefighter. That little circle is probably somebody's head, and that little stick-looking figure, like a snowman's arm, is probably a hose spewing water, right? You can see that the symbol for doctor is probably a stethoscope. But those symbols were originally, at the beginning of the study, when the students had first started communicating to each other, much more complex than they are now. But the hieroglyphics simplified over time because the shared experiences of the two students together allowed them to be simplified. This suggests that one of the ways in which language becomes simpler over time is by the shared experiences of a culture. In order to illustrate this point to you, I'm going to post a clip of an individual who lives in Northern Ireland so that you can listen to his speech. Not just his accent, though his accent is difficult to understand, but also so that you can note the words that he uses and the fact that they are not the same as the words that you use. And you'll see that the words that are used even within America are not the same depending on where you live. Here in the Pacific Northwest, we have a different vocabulary than individuals who live in the South. Now, for the most part, English is English, wherever you go in the world. But each individual subset of individuals within each shared environment come to decide on some specific words that mean something within their culture, within their shared experience, that others outside of that shared experience do not know and cannot use because they're unfamiliar with those words. Once you've listened to this individual from Ireland, I also want you to go to the YouTube page where it says in closed captioning what it is he's saying. Then, finally, on page 52, we see an example of another experimental study investigating the changes of language over time. Now, in these two experimental situations described in this digging deeper part, you'll note that these are not full-blown languages, but the experimenters set up a language-like environment that might give us hints about some small aspect of language. And by giving us that insight on just one part of a language, we can understand languages on the whole better. But the specific study that was done in this situation was to give research participants maybe a dozen of these random syllable sequence that you see in figure 2.8 right there at the top, like kihemiwi, okay? And they would pair those random syllable sequences with a shape of a specific color and a specific path of motion. And after pairing random syllables with these shapes, they asked participants to make their best guess about what another random shape would be called. Now, if we had done this, a similar experiment like this, not language-based, but some kind of matching experiment with, not with a non-human animal, then the likelihood that they would make some pattern emerge would be slim to none. Animals do not observe patterns where patterns don't exist, but humans have a propensity for doing that all the time. In one study, not mentioned in the book, some research participants would hear sequences of sounds in one or the other ear administered through a set of headphones. And when they would hear these noises, they were told to raise one hand or the other. Several trials later, the experimenters said, "Now, this time we want you to make a prediction about which side you're going to hear the sound before you actually hear it. So we want you to predict the sequence that we're going to play." Always before, the researchers had given random sequences to the left and right ear respectively. But by this final trial, participants had convinced themselves that there was some elaborate pattern inherent in the task. In much the same way, in this language experiment on page 52, we see that participants observed patterns to exist, connections between the sounds and the words and the pictures that had been shown, such that after having seen a half dozen or a dozen examples of pairings of the word and the picture, then they began to invent for themselves some kind of connection between these random syllables and the pictures that were presented, so that they would make connections between what different parts of the word might mean and the picture components, the movement or the color or the shape. And once those components had been embedded in the participants' responses, they were used to present to subsequent participants. And so on the subsequent trials, the sequences of letters were not actually random. They were dictated by the previous participant. And so any patterns that they had pretended to observe the first time through would be communicated down to the next participant. And any patterns that became more prominent by the second participant would be passed on to the third participant, and so on, so that each participant was exposed to the answers from the previous participant. After 10 iterations of this, some serious patterns began to emerge. Now, the patterns themselves aren't really the important part here. The important part of this study is that usage entrenches patterns in language. Even if one individual uses some words incorrectly, the way that most people use a word is what's considered, and those patterns by lots of people on the aggregate, all collected together, will inform your own use of the language, and your use of the language will be consistent with what most other people do. So this gives us some insight into the reason why even one language like English, used all over the world in Australia and Ireland and Scotland and England and America and Canada, can over time become drastically different depending on the country that you live in.